No way, why? I received a call that my daughter, who was in her final month of pregnancy, had died during childbirth. Apparently, she had already been returned home, so my husband and I rushed over immediately. When I saw my daughter's body in the casket, I nearly collapsed from grief. But when I looked at her face through the small window of the coffin, something felt off. As I instinctively reached out to touch her, my son-in-law hurriedly stopped me. What's more, no matter how much I begged him to open the lid for a final farewell, he stubbornly refused. Something was wrong. When I found a moment to examine my daughter's body discreetly, I, as a nurse, was certain. This was neither illness nor accident. It was undoubtedly murder. I'm Patricia. I worked as a nurse for 40 years and am now retired as a homemaker. My daughter Monica was also a nurse, and she got married at 30. Her partner was Paul, whom she met in college, but when we were introduced to him, my husband and I felt he was somewhat unreliable. You see, when Monica said she wanted to marry Paul, he was a part-time worker. Although he had the respectable qualification of a pharmacist, he hadn't taken up that profession after graduating from college. So we opposed it and set the condition that we would approve their marriage once Paul started working full-time and had a stable income. However, Paul couldn't find a job, and partly at Monica's request, my husband reluctantly had him hired at the pharmaceutical company where he worked. Just when we thought Paul was working diligently, his sales performance was terrible, and according to his supervisor, Paul was always slacking off and had quite a bad reputation with clients. As a result, his salary seemed to be low, and their lifestyle apparently depended on Monica's nursing job. In the midst of this, Monica's pregnancy was confirmed. Don't overdo it, I told her to take care of herself, as her job involved standing most of the time. Monica replied in a calm voice, "It's okay, Emily's here." Emily was Monica's friend from college, and she also had a relationship with Paul. Emily was a midwife working at a maternity clinic near Monica's apartment, and since Monica's workplace didn't have an obstetrics department, she decided to give birth there. Monica's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and I was looking forward to the birth of my first grandchild. However, as the due date approached, I suddenly received a call from Paul. It can't be true. Why? I couldn't believe what I heard on the phone, and my mind went blank. He said that Monica had died during childbirth. I'll come right away. It's at Emily's hospital, right? But Paul stammered and said, Monica passed away yesterday, and her body has already been brought home and placed in a coffin. Why didn't you tell me immediately? I stopped myself from saying the words that were about to come out. Thinking it would be a waste of time to argue over the phone, my husband and I headed to our daughter's apartment. What on earth happened? We confronted Paul together. I'm sorry. I couldn't believe Monica was gone either, so I couldn't make the call. He seemed so distraught that he couldn't properly answer my questions. Seeing this, his friend Emily explained, it was due to massive bleeding. Apparently, she had been by Monica's side the whole time. And then I had a sorrowful encounter with my daughter. My husband next to me couldn't hold back his tears and sobbed when he looked at Monica's form through the small window of the coffin. It was when I peeked in too. Something was off. I felt it instinctively. As a nurse myself, I had seen pregnant women lose their lives during childbirth before. So I knew that the most common cause of death was massive bleeding, but something about my daughter's face was different from that. When I instinctively reached out to touch my daughter, Paul and Emily hurriedly stopped me. Then please, open the lid of the coffin. That's not allowed by the funeral home. But this is my last goodbye to Monica. I wanted to confirm my suspicions more clearly, so I asked Paul, but he flatly refused. Thinking I had to investigate somehow, I asked Emily to buy some drinks, and after she left, I signaled to my husband with my eyes. He seemed to understand immediately and took Paul outside on some pretext. Taking that opportunity, I opened the lid of the coffin and examined my daughter's body. And my sense of unease turned into certainty. Just as I thought. It was so shocking that I felt dizzy and could barely stand. Still, I managed to close the lid just before the three returned from outside. Suddenly feeling nauseous from thinking about too many things, I said, "Excuse me for a moment," and left the room, rushing to the apartment building's parking lot. Not wanting to be seen by many people, I crouched in a shadowy spot when two figures came there. These people didn't seem to notice I was there and started arguing. From their conversation, I learned yet another shocking truth. I could feel an uncontrollable anger welling up inside me. A while later, when I returned to the room, Paul had just finished discussing with the funeral director, who left saying, "Then, tomorrow." Wondering what tomorrow meant, I asked, and my husband informed me, "The funeral has been set for tomorrow. There's no need to rush like that. There won't be time to notify Monica's friends and acquaintances if it's tomorrow." Then Paul sneered, "You might not know, but small family funerals are the norm these days. We don't need to make a big fuss, just seeing her off with just us is fine." Even Emily agreed with the family funeral, saying, "Monica's friends are busy and can't attend." She herself would attend, but she wouldn't listen to my opinion. Thinking it was pointless to argue further, I decided to hurry home. After all, I had a lot to do. When I got home, I noticed an envelope in the mailbox. It was a letter from Monica addressed to me, and from the postmark, I could tell it was probably mailed the day before she gave birth. I hastily opened it, and inside were Monica's hopes for the future overflowing. "I'm writing this letter because it's embarrassing to say face to face," it began, followed by expressions of gratitude to us. Next, her hopes for the child to be born. Since she knew it was going to be a girl, she wrote in dancing letters that she wanted to name her Emma. And as for what Monica wanted to do for her daughter, many things were listed. Finally, it concluded with, "I think I'll be relying on you a lot from now on, so please take care of us." My husband and I couldn't stop our tears as we read the letter over and over again. After crying for a while, I decided to take revenge for Monica. As preparation, I contacted various parties and made several arrangements. I also had one important request from my husband. This was the beginning of our counterattack. After that, I headed to the hospital to do the most important thing. And the next day, which was supposed to be the day of the family funeral, neither my husband nor I left the house. Then, in the early afternoon, Paul came barging in with Emily, yelling, "What's the meaning of this?" When I went to the funeral home, they said Monica's funeral had been cancelled. "It was your doing, wasn't it?" Paul glared at us, while Emily frowned beside him. "That's not all. When I went to the hospital, they said you had taken the baby Monica gave birth to. What's going on?" "Well, wouldn't it be pitiful for Emma to be left alone in the hospital without her mother, Monica?" Since there were no particular problems with Emma's health, when I presented my ID at the hospital and explained the situation, they let me take Emma. "Emma?" Emily looked puzzled. "It's the baby's name." Isn't it lovely? Then Paul approached me, his anger showing. Don't name her without my permission. It wasn't me, Monica chose the name. Look here. I held out my daughter's letter in front of him. Paul stumbled over his words. Well, that's fine then. But about the funeral. I interrupted him and glared. I looked into the funeral home you arranged, and they had a bad reputation, so I changed it to one I know. They didn't have an opening, so the funeral will be in a week, but that's okay, right? When I said this all at once, Paul glared back at me with bulging eyes. Don't do things on your own without consulting me. Oh? Is there some problem with delaying the funeral? When I asked Paul, who was expressing his dissatisfaction, he fell silent. When I said, see you in a week then, and ushered them to the door, they reluctantly left. And a week later, many people had gathered at the funeral home to see Monica off. When I contacted Monica's friends, they all said they would make time to come and say goodbye. After all the attendees had gathered, I stepped forward and stood in front of the microphone. Thank you all for gathering here today for Monica. Before we begin the funeral, there's something I'd like to share with everyone. As I started speaking, Paul stood up and raised his voice. I didn't hear about this. However, I ignored him and continued. It's the public reading of my daughter's will. Huh? A will? Paul was surprised but grinned for a moment. I didn't miss that. And as the venue fell silent, in the presence of a lawyer, I began to read the will. The opening was filled with words of gratitude to Monica's stepfather. My husband is Monica's adoptive father. My ex-husband was wealthy, and when we first married, I was often badmouthed as a mere nurse after his money. In the end, unable to get along with his family, I left the house with Monica. After that, I met my current husband and married him when Monica was in kindergarten. We couldn't have children together, but my husband loved Monica as if she were his own. Some of the attendees who didn't know this fact were tearing up. That's all irrelevant, hurry up and read the important part. Isn't that what everyone's curious about? I ignored Paul's urging and continued reading. Monica's biological father had passed away when she was in college. At that time, Monica inherited a substantial estate. The amount was about $3 million, and Monica wanted us to use that money, but it had nothing to do with me, and I had no reason to accept anything from my ex-husband. So when I advised Monica, keep it, it might come in handy someday, she entrusted the management of the inheritance to a lawyer. In that case, as Monica's husband, I have the right to receive her inheritance, right? Paul grinned happily, and I smiled as I informed him, but you know, Monica said the amount was too large for her, so after consulting with the lawyer, she donated most of it. What? Then how much is left? Paul made a fuss upon hearing about the donation. When the lawyer announced the remaining amount, Paul sighed in relief. So $1 million remain. Well, I guess that's fine. However, the will states that the inheritance is to be divided equally among Monica's parents and her child to be born. When I announced the distribution of the inheritance, Paul's face turned red with anger. What? You've got to be kidding. What was the point of me marrying Monica then? The attendees looked at the shouting Paul with contempt, but he didn't notice. No matter how much you complain, this will is official and won't change. As I told him while looking him in the eye, Paul's face grew even redder, and he approached Monica's coffin. What are you doing? I have to give this girl a piece of my mind. He vigorously opened the lid of the coffin, but Paul's movement stopped when he looked inside. Why? To his surprise, my daughter's body wasn't there. I thrust a piece of paper at the surprised Paul. Look at this. It was the autopsy report of Monica's body examination. From the moment I had that sorrowful encounter with my daughter, I had been suspicious of her death. And when I opened Monica's coffin and saw her body, that suspicion turned into certainty. This was murder. So I consulted a doctor I knew, explained the situation, and he also felt it was strange, so he introduced me to a friend who was a medical examiner. And that person agreed to perform an autopsy on my daughter. Look closely. It says right here that the cause of Monica's death was neither illness nor accident. As people in the venue gasped in surprise, I continued, she was killed by a drug. The name of the drug is clearly written here. You did this, didn't you? As I confronted Paul, he stepped back. Actually, I had changed the funeral home to buy time for this autopsy. And I had the help of an acquaintance who was in charge there. Presented with the autopsy report, Paul was at a loss for words. Emily quietly approached Paul's side and whispered something in his ear. Then Paul suddenly looked up and grinned triumphantly. Sure, Monica might have died because of drugs, but that's irrelevant. Do you have any evidence that I used the drug? To the confident Paul, my husband now presented a ledger. It was from the pharmaceutical company where my husband had worked until retirement. In other words, it was the drug inventory ledger of the company where Paul worked. After my husband and his former subordinate carefully cross-checked the ledger with the drug inventory in the warehouse, it was discovered that the same drug that took Monica's life was missing. And there was only one person who entered the warehouse on the day that drug went missing. It's recorded in the company data. On that day, you, Paul, were the only one who went in and out of the warehouse. Paul's face gradually turned pale. However, this time Emily stepped forward in front of me. That could be a coincidence, and you can't conclude that the drug used on Monica was from Paul's company. Hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh. I took out my smartphone from my pocket and played an audio recording. It contained a conversation between a man and a woman. These are your voices, right? There was no need to confirm, as the man and woman in the audio data were calling each other Paul and Emily. I had turned the volume up to maximum, so the conversation echoed throughout the funeral home. Their argument was clearly recorded. On that day when I was hit by nausea, it was them arguing in the apartment building's parking lot. Thinking this could be evidence, I quickly activated my smartphone's voice recorder and recorded their conversation. I could have reported it to the police on the spot, but I decided to investigate myself in case other evidence might be destroyed. Of course, I also wanted to exact revenge with my own hands. The audio clearly recorded that they had killed Monica for her inheritance, and that Paul and Emily were having an affair. From the moment they learned that my daughter had received an inheritance during her college days, the two had been looking for an opportunity to kill her. For them, Monica's pregnancy was a chance. It was, of course, Emily who advised Monica to give birth at the hospital where she worked. Thus, during the confusion of my daughter's delivery, Emily injected Monica with the drug Paul had prepared. Moreover, you abandoned my suffering daughter and even tried to take the life of her child, didn't you? Of course. After all, if we didn't, Paul's share would be smaller. Emily was defiant and said this with an expression as if it was nothing. But unfortunately, the baby was saved because a part-time doctor performed emergency surgery on Monica. I felt sadness welling up beyond anger towards Emily. I didn't want to hear such terrible words from Emily, who was in a profession so close to life as a midwife. If only there was no child, I could have received that share of money too. Paul had even instructed Emily to take the child out of the hospital and dispose of it. Paul, so obsessed with money, didn't have a shred of affection for his own child. The venue was in an uproar, with some people looking at the two with angry eyes, and others bursting into tears. That's why I took Emma from the hospital. To protect her from your hands. As I coldly declared this, Paul tried to lunge at me. However, my husband and the people around us caught Paul, and he was pathetically pinned to the floor. The police will be here soon. Give it up. I had asked the lawyer to notify the police at the right time. But the child is actually safe, and Monica would be happy. From now on, I'll raise my daughter with love, so please, just don't call the police. Paul suddenly became timid and pleaded. Don't be ridiculous. People like you should rot in hell. I will never forgive you. Soon, we could hear police sirens in the distance. And as they were dragged away by the arriving officers, they were still crying and screaming, please, forgive us. We don't want to go to the police. After that, Paul and Emily ended up in prison for this incident. The lawyer told me that those who take a life have no inheritance rights, so Paul couldn't even receive the inheritance that remained as his legal portion. Paul was fired from his company, and Emily had her midwife license revoked. A dark life awaits them where they'll have to crawl on the ground, but that's no longer our concern, and we don't have time to worry about such things. After all, we're very busy with childcare for the first time in 30 years. That being said, it's very enjoyable and every day is fulfilling. We've decided to use all the inheritance Monica left for Emma's sake. And everything that Monica wrote she wanted to do for Emma as a mother, we now want to do in her place.